It's kind of weird that we just had the battle for the two best teams in Test cricket, and it was a two-test series that didn't really get that much attention and was tucked into the bosom of the World Cup, and key players were rested for it.
This is the last knock. My dad told me to say this.
And now the Ashes is coming up next against the 3rd and 4th ranked teams with a giant inflatable urn and an entire industry kind of built around it. And in real terms, it's probably not worth that much more than 2 Indian tests against New Zealand, if at all. The whole thing is kind of bizarre. So this series has ended up being a bit of an amuse-bouche for the Ashes, despite the fact the Ashes should actually be this series' undercard. Cricket, eh? Adding to all that is the fact that New Zealand just lost to an Indian light 11, Indian 0, if you will, right after beating them to win the World Test Championship. I think that reinforces the belief that many had that New Zealand are really good, but maybe not as rounded as India to win everywhere. Of course, New Zealand is probably good enough to win in most places, and not Australia, and I'm only including this before the reply guys come into the comments. But in Asia against the top side, I can't see how they're that level. It's not to say that they're rubbish, because they were kept in the Kanpur match by their seam bowlers, and it's worth mentioning Tim Southee because he doesn't appear like he should be this good in Asia, but he actually is very much this good in Asia. And we weren't sure how Kyle Jamieson would be in Asia either, and I thought he held up fairly well. I personally enjoyed his tour the most when he was very angry for his last spell on day 2 and he just bounced everyone. So this part of their team held up, even if they didn't throw Neil Wagner in, which realistically they probably could have. The problem was always going to be, the spinners, because this is New Zealand and the problem is almost always the spinners. Even with quicks doing well in Asia over the last few years, there are still times when they're just not much use in these conditions, so you obviously need high quality spin options. Ajaz Patel is probably a very good spinner to have as your backup Asian spinner if you're a non-Asian team. I mean, he's still yet to take a wicket in home tests in 3 tries, although they barely bowl him in those tests anyway. But to have him in your back pocket for when you tour somewhere like Asia, that's ideal. That he had one magical day is magnificent, lovely, everything you want it to be. But we can't discount the fact that he was probably favoured by the pitch in Kanpur as well, and he really struggled there. But quite obviously, Ajaz Patel is not the problem. He took 17 wickets across this series, and that's really good, fantastic, surprising. And that's also 17 more wickets than Will Somerville took in the same 2 tests. They just need a better second option. Because at the moment, teams can set them up in Asia on tracks like Wankhede, where if their fast bowlers can't do any damage, well, Ajaz would have to take quite literally 20 wickets for them to win that test. And not that this is a new thing. New Zealand have always struggled to find and make and develop spinners because their pitchers hate them. If nothing else, Ajaz's wickets might inspire more kids to take up the art. I don't know, but it would be nice. But I want to highlight Wil Young because he struggled after his first innings in Kanpur, and so he didn't really become the story. But that was a remarkable knock considering how much the rest of their batters struggled for, the series really. For someone in his 4th match and first in Asia, I thought it showed very clever processes, like he'd really thought the way through to make runs. He's 29 and he has a decent first-class batting record. Obviously he comes out of the team if Denford Conway is fit, but with him at the top and Daryl Mitchell, whose last innings was also quite impressive, it shows that New Zealand depth is really strong. There was a time when New Zealand cricket would bring in players in their late 20s and they just wouldn't look up to international cricket. That's quite clearly not the case anymore. Even their backups are incredible. New Zealand's victory on this tour was the Kanpur draw. Or can draw? I don't know. I haven't really thought that through. Not only did it allow them to hang in this series for longer than many touring teams do in India these days, it's probably 4 points they didn't expect in the World Test Championship. Or they might have expected it. It's maybe 4 points that the rest of us hadn't quite thought that they would get in this championship. But emotionally, it was also a very important thing for New Zealand, as they were never going to win this series, but it meant that straight after winning the World Test Championship, they weren't about to lose their next game against that same opposition. Of course, it's slightly lessened by the fact that in the next match, they lost by like a record margin and was quite messy. So what about India, who had a weakened seam bowling and batting lineup, but because of this, they got to take another look at players like Mayank Agarwal. The problem, of course, with Mayank Agarwal is they already knew he was very good at home. I think he's averaging over 80 at home and around 20-odd away. So the real questions really remain how he's going to handle the ball just outside off stump consistently in Test cricket. Shreyas is the same, although with him it's only questions. We just don't know how anything he has done will translate at all beyond Asia. But what an incredible first test. He overcame some early nerves, got into his first knock pretty well, but to be honest, for me, the second knock was just way more special. My worry is that he's going to have to learn how to play outside of Asia in Test matches, which considering how much bowlers are dominating right now it's not ideal, is it? But if you're going to start, I suggest doing it like this. And I want to highlight Jayant Yadav because no one has ever highlighted Jayant Yadav ever before. He is probably 5th on India's finger spin bowling depth chart, maybe their 3rd best off spinner, and yet he comes into this test as a replacement with a test 100 before, shows good batting skills again, and also bowls quite well in the second innings, which is kind of when you want your 3rd spinner to do well. He's 5th choice at absolute best, and yet again it just shows the incredible depth that India has. And this is part of the reason why Ajaz Patel is still an outside chance of having one of the greatest bowling averages of all time. This test, his bowling average ballooned to 11.86 because he only took 3 wickets, though still no one actually managed to hit him. But in both innings he made runs as well, finally showing the batting talent that many of us knew he had. He's just a ridiculous cricketer at the moment to keep as a backup. And he seems to be suggesting the same, trying to, move his way forward above 2 all-time players ahead of him. We probably have to talk about Rahane, Ishant and Pujara. I think that you have to travel to South Africa, assuming that in any way India actually do travel to South Africa. But assuming that they do, you would have to take one of Rahane and Pujara in the squad. The thing is that I think Rahane would be easier to replace, as there seems to be a lot of middle order players out there, but Rahane is probably more suited to South Africa than Pujara is. It's kind of weird, but surely they don't need both of them on the tour anymore. Those guys have had their chances. I still think they're both fantastic cricketers, but the Indian middle order isn't making runs, and I've got no problems with them being in the squad, but I think some other players probably deserve a go in the side. As for Ishant, he's played 2 bad tests in a row, and people are willing to ignore how dominant he's been for a very, very long time. Personally, he just doesn't look fit to me. And maybe he is past it, but he was close to the world's best bowler for a very long period of time. You don't dump that after 2 bad tests, even if you have good replacements, which is the same reason why Rahane and Pujara weren't dumped. These decisions make sense. If you can find players who are that good, you don't just get rid of them. You at the very least keep them around. It would be an absolute crime if India just moved on from Ishant now. He's far too good a bowler. And after all those years where he struggled and he finally got good, it would also be the weirdest thing ever. They carried him in the team when he wasn't that good. Then he gets really good, has 2 bad tests and they flick him. I really don't think India is going to do that. I picked India to make the World Test Championship final, but I was also aware that they may not get full points playing a team as good as New Zealand at home. They'll be frustrated to get so close in Kanpur, but they showed that they are better than New Zealand by some distance at home. And they're still certainly one of my picks for the final. I'm not sure we actually learnt that much from this series. I think we knew that India was good in India, and even a full-strength New Zealand team was always going to struggle, even against a weakened Indian team here, just because of the options that they had. But we got a tight draw. A bloke took 10 wickets in an innings, some very good performances from some young Indian batters, some decent performances from some New Zealanders as well. I don't know. Plus there was also jokes about Nitin Menon and the light meter. Isn't that what Test cricket's really about?